Hi, and welcome back to our series of videos on the news culture of early modern times. And the question we'd like to ask today is, where does information come from and where does it go? This is one of the great questions we're asking in our research on the handwritten newsletters of our period. Today, we will look at the question exclusively from the standpoint of the objects themselves. In other words, the newsletters and their texts. And so far, we are discovering that news has many faces, and some news has many copies of the same face, so to speak. Our examples today are all from the vast number of such items collected and filed by the Medici dynasty in Florence and now in the State Archive in many, many bound volumes and sheafs of loose sheets. First of all, let's take a look at these two newsletters from Milan dated 14 May 1588. Different hands, but the contents, as we will see, is pretty much the same. Here again is the newsletter you saw on the left, translated, talking about the latest antics of the Duke of Guise in Paris. Now let's compare the contents of the newsletter on the left with the one on the right. And from the original Italian, we see that they are practically the same thing. And in fact, if we analyze the two texts using a great tool called diff checker, we see the close similarity. Significant differences are the darkly shaded areas. The rest is identical. At the current state of research, we can say that the two newsletters are closely related. Were they written in the same copy shop? Are they copies one of the other? Or do they depend on a third original? A further level of research will be necessary. The situation gets more complicated in the case of these two newsletters from Antwerp, both dated 19th of March, 1588. The newsletter on the left gives an account of things going on in Ostend and Middelburg during the Low Country Wars. The newsletter you previously saw on the right, dated the same day and place, includes basically the same stories. But if we look more carefully at the contents, examining the four main points, the meeting between the Duke of Parma and the English commissioners, the news from Middelburg about the agreement with the Queen of England, the arrival of the English admiral with a fleet, and the despair about peace, we see that they are all written up in different ways. Also, the right-hand example includes an entirely exclusive story about the Monsignor Ciampini highlighted in purple. And if we put these through our diff checker, we see that the dark shaded portions dominate, and only a handful of words are lightly shaded, meaning that almost all text is differently worded. So what comes from what? One thing is certain, the texts do not depend on each other. A reasonable conclusion is that both depend on one or different other texts, perhaps in other languages. But let's move on to an even more complex pair of examples. First, here's a newsletter from Venice, dated 18th June 1588. As you see, it also has news from Antwerp, Cologne, and yet another report from Venice from back on the 2nd of June. If we go back to the first page of the newsletter, we find the first story from Venice talks about news brought in from Constantinople, including the latest on the Polish Succession War. Antwerp news in this newsletter talks about different opinions regarding the ongoing peace negotiations. And here, also in the report from Antwerp, we find the latest on the Spanish Armada and Francis Drake. Now, with all that in mind, let's turn to a newsletter from Antwerp dated on the 28th of May. Here, the first story is about the discussions regarding the ongoing peace negotiations, which we saw down deep into the newsletter from Venice. And if the language there reminded you of this one, you can see, in fact, that the story is identical. And here you have the Italian originals, identical in every respect. Here again, in the same newsletter from Antwerp, we find the story from London about Francis Drake and the Spanish Armada, using the same words. Now, down towards the end of the Antwerp newsletter of 28 May that we've been looking at, there is a story from Venice dated to the 18th of June with May crossed out. And if we compare that story to the lead story in the newsletter from Venice that we were looking at a minute ago, we see again the same basic material. Letters from Constantinople, the Grand Turk's illness causing trouble, imperial ambassador coming with a gift, groups of warriors ready to swear loyalty to the Turk, Persia pretty quiet except for General Farhat, and Ahmet Basa on the march. Apart from those stories, repeated in both newsletters in different forms, the Venice version has some exclusives highlighted in brown concerning Poland and some troubles on the field. So what comes from what? Clearly, there are derivations from other originals yet to be found. But just from the evidence of the pages themselves in this and the other examples, we see that individual news items are the stock in trade of the newsletter business and may be lifted entirely or else cut up and redistributed according to the demand or the known taste of the subscriber. And on this note regarding audience expectations, we pause for now and thank you for watching, and we look forward to having you here again for another of our videos.